They thought they were firing me in front of their three biggest investors, but they didn't know that at that exact moment, I was executing the final signature to transfer their entire $2.1 billion deal into my name. No drama, no tears, just a plan that started 6 months ago, and a signature they never bothered to notice. While they celebrated erasing me from their boardroom, I was quietly becoming the only person who could make their deal legal. My name is Leona Kessler, and at 3:04 p.m. on a Tuesday that started like any other, I watched my 22-year career get executed in front of three men who controlled more money than most small countries. The 50th floor of Viridian Core Capital's Chicago headquarters had always felt like a throne room to me, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. Italian marble that cost more per square foot than most people's annual salaries, and a conference table so polished you could see your reflection being shattered in it. Today, that reflection showed a woman who'd spent 2 decades building something that was about to be torn down in under 5 minutes. Miles Denham sat at the head of the table like he'd been born there, though he'd only been our CEO for 8 months. 8 months of systematically undermining every strategic initiative I'd built, every relationship I'd cultivated, every deal I'd shepherded from conception to billion-dollar reality. His perfectly styled salt and pepper hair and $1,000 suit couldn't hide what he really was, a corporate politician who'd never closed a deal that mattered. To his right sat the trinity of power that had flown in for today's signing, Harrison Blackwood from Meridian Holdings, whose pension funds controlled half the Midwest's retirement security. Viktor Kozlov representing the Eastern European Energy Consortium that could make or break our international expansion, and Ayman Yue from the Singapore Sovereign Wealth Fund, whose quiet nod could move markets. I'd worked with each of them personally. Blackwood still called me the numbers whisperer after I'd saved his portfolio from a catastrophic oil futures miscalculation in 2019. Kozlov trusted my risk assessments more than his own analysts. I'd been the one to identify the Ukrainian pipeline vulnerabilities 18 months before anyone else saw them coming. And Ayman had said something to me 6 months ago that I'd never forgotten. If they forget your value, call me first. Gentlemen, Miles began, his voice carrying that practiced corporate warmth that fooled exactly no one in this room. Before we proceed with today's historic agreement, I need to address a personnel matter. My coffee cup stopped halfway to my lips. Personnel matter. The phrase that preceded every corporate assassination I'd ever witnessed. As Viridian moves into this new phase of growth, we need leadership that reflects our bold vision for the future. Miles's eyes found mine across the table, and I saw something there that wasn't quite satisfaction, it was relief, like he'd been waiting months for this moment. Unfortunately, some of our current strategic approaches have become conservative, safe, and in today's market, safe is the enemy of profitable. I set my coffee down carefully, my hands steady despite the adrenaline now flooding my system. 22 years of navigating corporate warfare had taught me that the moment you show weakness is the moment they smell blood. Leona has served this company with dedication, he continued, and I almost laughed at the past tense. But we need someone bolder at the helm of our international initiatives, someone who isn't afraid to take the kinds of risks that create generational wealth. Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Victor's expression remained stone-faced, but I caught him glancing at his phone. And Ayman? Ayman was watching me with an intensity that suggested he knew exactly what was happening and had been expecting it. Effective immediately, Miles said, pulling out a manila folder that had been sitting beside his legal pad. We'll be transitioning leadership of the Green Axis Solar Initiative to new management. Jenna Rowe will be taking point on all international strategic partnerships moving forward. Jenna Rowe, 31 years old, MBA from Wharton, and exactly 0 experience closing deals larger than a suburban strip mall development. She sat 2 seats down from Miles, trying to look confident, but mainly succeeding at looking terrified. The documentation is all prepared, Miles continued, sliding the folder toward the center of the table. We can execute the transition today and move forward with our signing without any delays. The silence in the room was deafening. These three men hadn't flown halfway around the world to watch a middle management reshuffling. They'd come here because they trusted the person who'd structured this deal, who'd identified the opportunities, who'd navigated the regulatory complexities that had killed similar projects for the past 5 years. That person was sitting right here, being systematically erased from her own work. "I see," I said finally, my voice carrying none of the rage that was building behind my sternum. "And the compliance documentation for the cross-border energy certificates, the EPA liaison agreements, the blockchain verification protocols for the carbon offset trading." Miles waved a hand dismissively. "All handled. Jenna's been briefed on the essential elements." Essential elements. As if a $2.1 billion international energy deal could be reduced to bullet points in a PowerPoint presentation. I stood up slowly, gathering my portfolio and the leather briefcase that had been my companion through every major negotiation of the last decade. "Well then," I said, looking directly at Eamon, who gave me the slightest nod, barely perceptible, but enough. "I suppose my work here is done." Miles actually smiled. "We appreciate your years of service. Leona, HR will be in touch about the transition details." I walked toward the door, my heels clicking against the marble with a rhythm that sounded almost like a countdown. As my hand touched the brushed steel door handle, I turned back one final time. "Gentlemen, I hope you'll find everything you need to complete today's signing, though I should mention you might want to double-check folder 3 of the compliance documentation. Sometimes the most important details are in the appendices." And then I walked out, leaving behind the only professional home I'd ever known, carrying with me the knowledge that in approximately 25 minutes, everything they thought they knew about this deal was about to change forever. 22 years. That's how long it took to build something they dismantled in 5 minutes. I sat in my car in the parking garage beneath Viridian, staring at the concrete pillar in front of me, letting the memories flood back. Not the sanitized corporate history they'd probably write about my tenure, but the real story. The late nights, the impossible deadlines, the deals that shouldn't have worked but did because I made them work. I was 28 when I started here, fresh out of Northwestern with an MBA and enough student debt to motivate a small army. Back then, Viridian was a mid-tier energy investment firm trying to break into the big leagues. I was hired as a junior analyst, the kind of position where you're expected to crunch numbers, keep your head down, and maybe if you're very lucky and very quiet, get promoted to senior analyst before you turn 40. But I'd never been good at keeping quiet when I saw opportunities others missed. My first major save came during the 2008 financial crisis. While everyone else was panicking about the housing market collapse, I noticed something in the commodities data that didn't add up. Natural gas futures were trading like the world was ending, but the infrastructure demand projections told a different story. I spent 3 weeks building a model that showed how a strategic pivot could turn the crisis into the buying opportunity of a decade. The partners didn't want to hear it. Too risky, they said, too aggressive for uncertain times. So I did what any reasonable junior analyst would do. I went around them. I scheduled a lunch with Margaret Thornfield, the pension fund manager who controlled our largest institutional client, and walked her through my analysis over Caesar salads and white wine. By dessert, she'd committed $40 million to the strategy. The returns were 340% over 18 months. That's when I learned the most important lesson of my career: loyalty flows upward until you prove it should flow down. By 2015, I was running international partnerships. By 2018, I was structuring deals that moved markets, the Green Axis Solar Initiative. The very deal they just tried to hand over to Jenna Rowe like a participation trophy had been my brainchild from day one. I'd identified the regulatory gaps that made cross-border renewable energy investments nearly impossible. I'd built relationships with bureaucrats in 7 countries. I'd navigated environmental impact assessments that read like phone books and compliance requirements that changed faster than weather patterns. But the save that should have guaranteed my position forever happened just 14 months ago, and Miles Denham was at the center of it. We were closing a $800 million wind farm development in offshore Maine, a project that had taken 3 years to structure and represented our biggest renewable play to date. Miles, who was vice president of strategic development then, had decided to optimize the contractual language 2 days before signing, without consulting me, without understanding the regulatory implications, without realizing that his optimization would trigger a federal environmental review that could delay the project by 18 months and kill the deal entirely. I found out about his changes during my routine pre-signing review at 11 p.m. on a Sunday night. The signing was scheduled for Tuesday morning. Our clients had already wired preliminary deposits. The press release was drafted. I had 36 hours to fix what he'd broken, or watch the biggest deal in company history collapse in public. I didn't sleep for the next day and a half. I called in favors from every contact I'd built over 15 years. I rewrote 17 sections of environmental compliance documentation. I got 3 separate federal agencies to provide expedited reviews on a timeline that shouldn't have been possible. I restructured the ownership cascade to satisfy requirements that Miles hadn't even known existed. The deal closed on schedule. The company made $340 million in fees. Miles got promoted to CEO 6 months later. He never thanked me, never acknowledged the save. In his version of events, which became the official company narrative, he'd identified and resolved some minor technical issues in the final documentation. That's when I realized something fundamental had shifted. The old Viridian, the company that had promoted me based on results, that had valued strategic thinking over political maneuvering, was dying. The new Viridian rewarded the right stories over the right outcomes. So I started preparing my own story, quietly, carefully, with the same methodical attention to detail that had made me successful in the first place. Because I'd learned something else during those 22 years in corporate America. They don't fire you when they don't need you anymore. They fire you when they think they can take credit for everything you built and pretend you were never essential to begin with. But here's what Miles never understood about the deals I structured, the relationships I'd built. The strategic frameworks I developed over 2 decades, they weren't just business transactions. They were carefully constructed ecosystems where every element depended on every other element. Remove the wrong piece, and the whole thing collapses. And I'd just become the wrong piece to remove. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a contact I hadn't called in 6 months. Singapore Capital. Advisory. My finger hovered over the number for exactly 3 seconds before I pressed call. He answered on the second ring. "I was wondering when you'd call," Eamon said, his accent carrying that particular blend of British precision and Singapore efficiency that had made him one of the most feared negotiators in Southeast Asia. "How long do we have?" I checked my watch, 3:17 p.m. 12 minutes before they realize they can't complete the signing without me, I said. "Are you ready?" "I've been ready since March. The question is, are you ready to stop being Viridian's victim and start being their biggest problem?" I started my car and pulled out of the parking space I'd occupied every weekday for nearly a quarter of my life. Let's find out. 6 months ago, I was sitting in this same car after the worst professional humiliation of my career, and I made a decision that would change everything. It was a Thursday in March when Miles first showed me exactly who he was. The Green Axis Solar Project was hitting a critical milestone, the preliminary regulatory approval that would unlock the first wave of international investment. I'd spent 18 months navigating the bureaucratic maze, building relationships with energy commissioners across 3 countries, and structuring the compliance framework that made a $2.1 billion cross-border renewable deal legally possible. Miles called me into his office that morning with what he described as exciting news. He'd been in talks with Goldman Sachs about bringing in additional strategic partners, without consulting me, without involving the legal team, without understanding that the partnership structure I'd created was specifically designed to avoid the regulatory triggers that major investment banks would automatically trip. "I think we can get them to commit $800 million, he said, practically bouncing in his chair like a kid who'd found the cookie jar. "They're excited about the scale potential." I explained, patiently and professionally, why Goldman's involvement would require restructuring the entire deal from the ground up, how it would trigger enhanced due diligence requirements that could add 18 months to the timeline. how their compliance protocols were fundamentally incompatible with the regulatory frameworks I'd spent 2 years navigating. Miles listened with the expression of someone waiting for me to finish talking, so he could explain why I was wrong. "Leona," he said finally, "I appreciate your attention to detail. I really do. But sometimes you have to think bigger picture. This isn't about crossing every T and dotting every I. This is about transformational growth." That's when I knew, not suspected, not worried knew. Miles Denham was going to destroy everything I'd built, and he was going to do it while genuinely believing he was making it better. So I started building something he couldn't destroy. The next morning, I drove to the Cook County Clerk's office and filed incorporation papers for Kessler Strategics, LLC, a consulting entity, wholly owned by me, specializing in international energy compliance and regulatory strategy, perfectly legal, completely above board, and structured specifically to handle the kind of complex cross-border transactions that were becoming Viridian's specialty. But Kessler Strategics wasn't designed to compete with Viridian. It was designed to survive Viridian. The key was understanding something fundamental about modern corporate law. Ownership isn't just about who signs the contracts. It's about who controls the compliance mechanisms that make those contracts legally enforceable. And in the brave new world of international renewable energy investment, compliance was everything. I spent the next 3 months quietly restructuring my role at Viridian. Instead of managing deals directly, I began outsourcing the most critical compliance work to specialized consultants, which happened to be my own company. Every regulatory filing, every cross-border certification, every environmental impact assessment that made these deals possible began flowing through Kessler Strategics. Miles loved it. He saw it as cost-effective delegation. "You've really streamlined our operations," he told me during my Q2 review. "This consultant model is brilliant." What he didn't see was the elegant legal architecture I was building. Every time Viridian signed a contract that included Kessler Strategics compliance protocols, they were agreeing to a very specific set of terms that included automatic transfer clauses, continuity provisions, and something I called key person protection language that specified what would happen if the individual responsible for regulatory compliance was suddenly removed from the project. The language was buried in subsection 12.7 of the Standard Compliance Addendum, written in the kind of legal prose that makes most people's eyes glaze over. Even our own legal team barely glanced at it. "Standard boilerplate," they said. "Industry best practices for risk mitigation." Miles signed every single one without reading it. But the real breakthrough came in late August, when Eamon Yue flew into Chicago for a private dinner. Officially, he was in town for a renewable energy conference. Unofficially, he was conducting due diligence on whether Viridian was the kind of long-term partner Singapore wanted for their ambitious carbon neutrality initiative. We met at Alinea, because Eamon appreciated the kind of precision that went into transforming simple ingredients into something transcendent. Over the course of 4 hours and 12 meticulously crafted courses, I walked him through the regulatory landscape that made international renewable investment so complex. Most firms treat compliance like a necessary evil. I explained as we shared a dessert that looked like a miniature forest growing from the plate. They hire lawyers to check boxes and hope for the best. But compliance isn't just about avoiding problems, it's about creating competitive advantages that others can't replicate. Eamon listened with the intensity of someone who'd built his career on finding opportunities others missed. "And if someone wanted to replicate what you've built here," he asked, "they'd need about 3 years, relationships in 7 regulatory agencies, and a very specific understanding of how environmental law intersects with international tax treaties." I paused, taking a sip of wine that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. "Or they could work with someone who's already done the work." That's when Eamon asked the question that changed everything. What would happen if Viridian decided they didn't need your expertise anymore? I'd been waiting for that question for months. "Well," I said, pulling out a leather portfolio that contained copies of every major contract I'd structured in the past year, "that would depend on how they chose to handle the transition. Some approaches might be smoother than others." Eamon spent the next hour reviewing the documentation with the kind of focus that had made him one of Asia's most successful sovereign wealth fund managers. When he finished, he looked up with something that might have been admiration. "This is elegant," he said, "and completely airtight. I prefer to think of it as professionally prudent. If they're foolish enough to cut you loose, Singapore Capital would be very interested in discussing exclusive partnership arrangements. We believe in working with the best, regardless of their current institutional affiliations." That night, I went home and made the final modifications to what I'd started calling my continuity protocol, a series of legal mechanisms that would ensure the work I'd built could survive any corporate restructuring, any personnel changes, any attempt to erase my contributions from the company's future. I never thought I'd need to use it, even as Miles became more erratic, more dismissive, more determined to reshape Viridian according to his own vision. I believed that results would matter more than politics. I was wrong about that. But I was absolutely right about everything else. The elevator down from the 50th floor felt like the longest 20 seconds of my life, but not for the reasons Miles would have expected. I wasn't devastated. I wasn't panicking. I was calculating. My phone buzzed as the elevator reached the 40th floor. A text from Eamon. "Watching the newsfeed. Ready when you are." 35th floor. Another buzz. This time from Sarah Martinez at Morgan & Leith, LLP. "Compliance transfer docs are prepared. Standing by for your signal." 22nd floor. A third message. From Nina Walsh. Viridian's junior administrative assistant. "They sent me to find folder 3. It's not in the system. Should I tell them?" I typed back quickly. "Tell them you're still looking. We'll advise shortly." The elevator doors opened into the marble lobby where I'd walked through every morning for 22 years. The same security guards who'd nodded good morning for over 2 decades watched me cross the floor, probably wondering why I was leaving in the middle of the afternoon. By tomorrow, they'd know. I pushed through the revolving doors onto South Wacker Drive. Chicago's financial district buzzing around me with its usual afternoon energy. Tourists taking photos of the Willis Tower. Food trucks serving overpriced lunch to office workers who'd rather eat on the street than spend another minute in their corporate towers. The familiar sounds of a city that never stopped moving, never paused to consider whether the deals being made in the glass towers above actually mattered to the people walking below. But today, one of those deals was about to matter very much. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I'd memorized months ago but never used. "Kessler Strategics Emergency Activation Protocol," I said when Sarah Martinez answered on the first ring. "Authorization code Tango 77 Alpha." "Confirmed. Initiating transfer sequence now. How long do I have?" I checked my watch, 3:19 p.m. 10 minutes before they realize what's happening. 15 before they understand what it means. More than enough. The blockchain timestamp is already processing. Singapore Capital's signature confirmation came through 20 minutes ago. As of 3:17 p.m. Central Time, all compliance protocols for the Green Axis Solar Initiative have been transferred to Kessler Strategics LLC per the automatic succession clauses in subsection 12.7 of the Regulatory Framework Agreement. I felt something loosen in my chest, not relief exactly, but the satisfaction of watching a complex machine perform exactly as designed. "What's the legal status of Viridian's current documentation?" I asked. "They're holding a signing ceremony for contracts that lost legal validity the moment you were terminated without proper transition protocols. Everything they think they're signing today is legally unenforceable without Kessler Strategic certification." "And the investors?" "Singapore Capital is already aware. Obviously, I'm sending notification to Meridian Holdings and the Eastern European Consortium now. Standard protocol, they'll receive documentation showing that the only legally compliant path forward is through the new framework." I walked north on Wacker, past the crowds of people who had no idea they were witnessing the exact moment when 22 years of preparation had crystallized into action. Every step I'd taken since March had led to this moment. Every carefully worded clause, every strategic relationship, every late night spent understanding regulatory frameworks that most people found mind-numbingly boring. Miles had been right about one thing: I was conservative. I was safe. I planned for contingencies that other people couldn't even imagine, but he'd made the same mistake that every corporate politician makes. He'd confused careful preparation with weakness. My phone rang as I reached the intersection of Wacker and Madison. Eamon's number. "It's done," he said without preamble. "Singapore's legal team has confirmed receipt of the transfer documentation. Meridian and the Europeans are reviewing now, but the compliance chain is clear. You're the only authorized entity that can certify this deal for international execution." How are they responding? Professionally, Meridian's Harrison called it an interesting development in regulatory oversight. Victor's team is treating it as standard risk management protocol. They're experienced enough to know that compliance questions can kill billion-dollar deals overnight. I turned east on Madison, heading toward the Federal Building where Morgan and Leith maintained their satellite office. And Miles, still in his meeting, as far as I know, though I suspect that's about to change. As if summoned by our conversation, my phone started ringing, Viridian's main number. "That would be them now," I said to Eamon. "Are you going to answer?" I looked at the screen, watching Miles's extension flash across the display. After a moment, I declined the call. "No," I said. "Let them figure it out themselves. They wanted someone bolder at the helm of international initiatives. Now they've got her." The Morgan and Leith office occupied 3 floors of a granite tower that looked like it had been built to survive financial apocalypses. Sarah Martinez met me in the lobby, a woman in her 50s who'd built a career on making the impossible legally possible. She handed me a leather portfolio that contained the culmination of 6 months of the most careful legal architecture I'd ever commissioned. "Everything's here," she said as we rode the elevator to the 32nd floor. "The transfer documentation, the compliance certifications, the new partnership framework with Singapore Capital. Once you sign, you'll be the sole authorized representative for the largest renewable energy deal in Midwest history. And Viridian. Legally speaking, they'll be bystanders to their own transaction. They can file challenges, of course, but the succession clauses they agreed to are ironclad. Their only path forward is negotiating new terms with you." We walked into a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River. The documents were spread across a mahogany table, each page tagged with colored tabs, indicating where my signature was required. My phone buzzed with another call from Viridian, then another, then a text from a number I didn't recognize. "This is Jenna Rowe. We need to discuss the compliance documentation urgently. Can you call me back?" I turned the phone face down on the table and picked up the first pen. "Let's make this official," I said. The signatures took exactly 7 minutes to complete. 7 minutes to transform from a terminated employee into the sole proprietor of a $2.1 billion international energy deal. Sarah Martinez witnessed each page, her notary stamp making everything legally ironclad with the kind of finality that corporate lawyers dream about and executives have nightmares over. "Congratulations," Sarah said as I signed the final document. "You now control the most complex renewable energy compliance framework in North America." My phone had been buzzing nonstop for the past 10 minutes. Viridian's main number, Miles's direct line, Jenna Rowe's extension, and even the company's general counsel. I'd ignored them all. But now curiosity was getting the better of me. "I think it's time to see how they're handling the news," I said, picking up my phone. 12 missed calls, 8 text messages, and 1 voicemail from Miles that I decided to listen to right there in the conference room. "Leona, this is Miles. We need you back here immediately. There seems to be some confusion about the compliance documentation for today's signing. Jenna can't locate folder 3, and our legal team is saying there might be some irregularities with the regulatory framework. Call me back as soon as you get this." I looked at Sarah, who was trying very hard not to smile. "Irregularities," she repeated. "That's one way to put it." The walk back to Viridian took exactly 12 minutes. 12 minutes during which my phone continued to ring with increasing desperation. By the time I reached the lobby, I had 17 missed calls and a text from Nina Walsh that simply said, "They're losing their minds up here." The elevator ride to the 50th floor felt different now. I wasn't going up as someone who worked here. I was going up as someone who held something they needed, something they couldn't get anywhere else. The executive floor was in controlled chaos. Jenna Rowe was pacing near the reception desk, her phone pressed to her ear, speaking in the kind of urgent whisper that meant she was talking to lawyers. Two junior associates were hunched over laptops, frantically scrolling through what I assumed were compliance databases, and through the glass walls of the main conference room, I could see Miles gesticulating wildly while Harrison Blackwood, Victor Kozlov, and Eamon Yue sat with the patience of people who'd seen corporate meltdowns before. Nina Walsh spotted me first. She was standing near the copy machine, holding what looked like a USB drive, her eyes wide with the expression of someone who'd just realized she was holding a grenade. "Ms. Kessler," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else could hear. "I found the backup files for folder 3, but—" She paused, looking genuinely distressed. "But the system says the access codes were transferred to an external entity at 3:17 p.m. today." I'd always liked Nina, 24 years old, Northwestern graduate, smart enough to see through corporate politics, but young enough to still believe hard work would be rewarded. She'd been the one to quietly tip me off about Miles's Goldman Sachs conversations back in March. She'd helped me organize the compliance documentation that made today's transfer possible, and now she was holding the one piece of evidence that could either save Viridian's deal or prove definitively that they'd lost control of it. "Nina," I said, taking the USB drive from her hand, "you've been incredibly helpful. What you found here is exactly what I need to resolve this situation." Her relief was visible. "So you can fix it. Whatever went wrong with the compliance transfer." "I can definitely fix it," I said, though it might not look like the kind of fix they're expecting. Jenna Rowe noticed me standing near the reception area and practically sprinted across the floor. "Leona, thank God you're here," she said, slightly out of breath. "There's been some kind of system error with the compliance documentation. The investors are asking questions about regulatory oversight, and I can't find any of the cross-reference materials you mentioned in the transition notes." I looked at her with the kind of patience you'd show a child who'd just asked why the sky was blue. "There weren't any transition notes. Jenna, Miles made it very clear that my services were no longer required. But surely you can help us locate the missing documentation. This is a company-wide priority." Through the conference room glass, I could see Miles notice my arrival. His expression shifted from relief to confusion to something approaching panic as he registered that I was holding a USB drive and speaking to his replacement in very measured tones. "I'd be happy to help," I said, loud enough for Miles to hear through the glass. "But I'm no longer a Viridian employee. Any consulting work would need to go through my company, Kessler Strategics, LLC." Miles practically burst through the conference room door. "Leona, we don't have time for corporate restructuring games," he said, his voice carrying the edge of someone whose carefully planned day was disintegrating in real time. "Whatever administrative issues we need to resolve, we can handle them after the signing. Right now, I need you to provide Jenna with the compliance documentation so we can move forward." I looked past him to the conference room, where three of the most powerful investors in international energy were watching this conversation, with the kind of professional detachment that suggested they'd already figured out what was happening. "I'm afraid that's not possible," I said. "The compliance documentation you're referring to is proprietary to Kessler Strategics. It was developed using methodologies and relationships that belong to my consulting practice." "Your consulting practice?" Miles's voice cracked slightly. "Leona, you developed that framework while you were employed by Viridian. It's company property." "Actually," I said, pulling out my phone and opening the document Sarah Martinez had emailed me 20 minutes earlier, "according to the intellectual property clauses in the Regulatory Framework Agreement, the one you signed in August, all compliance methodologies developed by external consultants remain the property of those consultants. Viridian licensed the use of those methodologies for specific projects under specific terms." I handed him my phone so he could read the relevant section. Terms that included automatic termination of licensing rights if the key personnel responsible for compliance oversight were removed from the project without proper transition protocols. Miles stared at the screen for a long moment, his face cycling through confusion, understanding, and what I could only describe as existential dread. "You're saying we can't complete the signing without your company's involvement?" "I'm saying that any attempt to execute the Green Axis Solar Agreement without proper Kessler Strategics compliance certification would expose all parties to significant regulatory liability. The investors' legal teams are already aware of this." Through the conference room glass, I could see Eamon checking his watch and saying something to Harrison and Victor. All three men stood up simultaneously. "But don't worry," I said, tucking the USB drive into my briefcase with the same casual efficiency I'd used to pack up my office an hour earlier. "I'm sure we can work something out." The three investors emerged from the conference room with the synchronized precision of men who'd made billion-dollar decisions in crisis situations before. Harrison Blackwood straightened his tie. Viktor Kozlov closed his leather portfolio with a decisive snap, and Eamon Yue simply nodded at me, the kind of acknowledgement that said he'd been expecting this moment for months. "Gentlemen," Miles said, his voice carrying forced optimism that fooled absolutely no one, "we're just working through some final administrative details. Nothing that should impact our signing timeline." Harrison looked at his watch, a platinum Patek Philippe, that probably cost more than most people's cars. "Miles, we've been in this business long enough to recognize when administrative details become structural problems. Our legal team received some interesting documentation about 20 minutes ago." Documentation. Miles glanced between me and the investors, clearly trying to piece together a puzzle where several crucial pieces had been moved when he wasn't looking. Victor spoke with the measured tone of someone who'd navigated post-Soviet bureaucracy and found American corporate politics quaint by comparison. "Compliance transfer notifications, very thorough, very legally precise, the kind of documentation that suggests someone has been planning for contingencies." Eamon stepped forward, and I could see him transitioning into the role that had made him one of Asia's most respected dealmakers. "Miles, I think we need to have a frank conversation about the regulatory framework that makes this transaction possible." "Of course," Miles said, gesturing toward the conference room. "Let's sit down and review whatever concerns—" "Actually," Eamon interrupted gently, "I think the conversation needs to include Ms. Kessler, since she appears to control the compliance mechanisms we need to complete this deal." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes either breakthrough negotiations or complete collapse. Miles looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, not anger, not frustration, but the dawning realization that the game had changed, and he didn't understand the new rules. "Perhaps," I said, settling into a chair at the conference table like I'd never left, "we should start with a clear assessment of where things stand." I opened my briefcase and pulled out a document folder, not the one Miles had been looking for, but a new one, prepared by Sarah Martinez's team and stamped with the official seal of Kessler Strategics, LLC. As of 3:17 p.m. today, all regulatory compliance protocols for the Green Axis Solar Initiative transferred to Kessler Strategics per the automatic succession clauses embedded in the original framework agreement. This includes environmental impact certifications, cross-border energy certificates, EPA liaison protocols, and blockchain verification systems for carbon offset trading. I slid copies across the table to each investor. They began reading with the focused attention of people who understood that billion-dollar deals lived or died in subsection clauses most people never noticed. "What this means," I continued, watching Miles's face as understanding finally dawned, "is that Viridian currently holds contracts for a transaction they cannot legally execute. Any attempt to proceed without proper Kessler Strategics certification would expose all parties to regulatory violations that could result in federal investigation, international sanctions, and complete loss of investment." Harrison finished reading first. "This is quite elegant," he said, looking up with something that might have been admiration. "You've essentially separated operational control from compliance authority." "It's a risk management strategy," I replied. "The renewable energy sector is too regulated, too internationally complex, to rely on single points of failure." Victor was nodding slowly, And Kessler Strategics is prepared to provide the necessary compliance certification. Under appropriate partnership terms, yes. Miles finally found his voice. Partnership terms, Leona. An hour ago, you were a Viridian employee. You can't just... An hour ago, you terminated my employment in front of 3 international investors, I said, my voice carrying the kind of calm that comes from having planned for exactly this moment. You made it very clear that Viridian no longer required my strategic expertise. Eamon leaned back in his chair, and I could see him enjoying the precision of what was unfolding. So what you're suggesting is that Viridian can either partner with Kessler Strategics to complete this transaction, or the deal doesn't happen, I finished. At least not in any form that resembles what we've been negotiating for the past 18 months. Jenna Rowe, who'd been standing near the door looking increasingly pale, finally spoke up. But surely there must be backup compliance systems, alternative certification pathways. The 3 investors looked at her with the patience of professors explaining basic concepts to a struggling student. Ms. Rowe, Harrison said gently, international renewable energy compliance isn't like changing accounting software. These frameworks take years to develop, require relationships with regulatory bodies in multiple countries, and depend on trust that can't be purchased or transferred. The EPA alone would need 6 months to verify alternative compliance protocols, Victor added. The European Energy Commission would need longer. By the time new certifications were in place, the economic conditions that make this deal attractive would no longer exist. Miles was staring at the documents spread across the table like they contained news of his own death, which, from a career perspective, they probably did. So what are you proposing? He asked finally. I pulled out one final document, a partnership agreement that Sarah Martinez had drafted with the same meticulous attention to detail that had made the original transfer possible. Kessler Strategics will provide all necessary compliance certification for the Green Axis Solar Initiative. In exchange, we'll receive a 25% stake in the project, direct partnership status with all international investors, and exclusive rights to manage regulatory oversight for any future renewable energy deals that exceed $500 million in total value. The numbers hung in the air like a challenge. 25% of $2.1 billion was more money than I'd made in my entire career at Viridian. Exclusive partnership rights would make me one of the most powerful players in renewable energy investment. And the look on Miles's face suggested he understood exactly what this meant for his own future. And if we don't agree to these terms, he asked. I closed my briefcase with the same decisive motion I'd used to pack up my office. Then you can explain to your board of directors why the biggest deal in company history collapsed because you decided you didn't need the person who made it possible. Eamon's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then looked up with the expression of someone who'd just received exactly the confirmation he'd been waiting for. Singapore Capital has reviewed the proposal, he said. We're prepared to proceed under the new partnership structure. Harrison and Victor exchanged glances, then nodded in unison. Meridian Holdings concurs, Harrison said. As does the European Consortium, Victor added. 3 international investors, representing over $1 trillion in combined assets, had just endorsed my hostile takeover of my own deal. Miles looked around the table at faces that were no longer looking to him for leadership. I need to make some calls, he said finally. Of course, I replied. Take all the time you need. Though I should mention that the compliance window for international certification closes at 5 p.m. today. After that, we'd need to restart the entire regulatory process. I checked my watch, 4:23 p.m. 37 minutes should be plenty of time to make a decision. Miles disappeared into his office for exactly 12 minutes. Through the glass walls, I could see him on 3 different phone calls, first with someone who made him pace frantically, then with someone who made him sit down heavily in his chair, and finally with someone who made him put his head in his hands. While he made his calls, the real power in the room had already shifted. Harrison was reviewing the partnership documents with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd restructured half the pension funds in the Midwest. Victor had his legal team on speakerphone, conducting rapid-fire due diligence in what sounded like 3 different languages. and Eamon was coordinating with Singapore's Regulatory Affairs Office, ensuring that the new partnership structure would satisfy their governmental oversight requirements. Jenna Rose stood near the window, staring out at Lake Michigan like she was watching her career prospects disappear into the horizon. She'd been brought in to manage a deal that was already fully structured, only to discover that the structure itself had been quietly transferred to someone else entirely. "Ms. Kessler," she said finally, turning back toward the table, "if this partnership moves forward, what happens to Viridian's role in the project?" It was a fair question, and one that demonstrated she was starting to understand the scope of what had just occurred. "Viridian remains the primary development entity," I replied. "They'll handle construction management, local permitting, day-to-day operations, all the things they're actually good at, but strategic oversight, regulatory compliance, and international coordination will be managed through Kessler Strategics. And my position," I looked at her with genuine sympathy. She'd been set up to fail, brought in to manage something she couldn't possibly understand in the time she'd been given. "That depends on whether you're interested in learning how international energy deals actually work, or whether you prefer the kind of strategic planning that looks good in PowerPoint presentations but falls apart when it meets regulatory reality." Before she could answer, Miles emerged from his office with the expression of someone who'd just been given a terminal diagnosis. He walked back to the conference table with the measured pace of a man trying to maintain dignity in the face of complete professional defeat. "I've spoken with our board of directors," he announced, settling into his chair like it might be the last time he'd sit at the head of this particular table. "They've authorized me to negotiate the terms of a partnership agreement with Kessler Strategics." The words came out like he was reading from a script he'd never wanted to memorize. "However," he continued, attempting to regain some semblance of control, "we'll need to discuss the specific terms of this arrangement. 25% seems aggressive for a consulting role." Harrison looked up from the documents he'd been reviewing. "Miles, with respect, this isn't a consulting role. Ms. Kessler has created a compliance framework that's essential to the viability of this project. Without it, you don't have a deal at all." Victor nodded in agreement. "In Eastern Europe, we call this structural dependency. When one entity controls mechanisms that others cannot replicate, the relationship becomes partnership by necessity, not choice." Eamon's phone buzzed again. He glanced at it, then looked directly at Miles. "I've just received confirmation from Singapore's Ministry of Trade and Industry. They're prepared to fast-track regulatory approval for this project, but only if the compliance structure remains under Kessler Strategics oversight. Changing the framework now would trigger a complete review process that could take 18 months. The deadline pressure was real, but it wasn't arbitrary. International renewable energy deals operated within windows of regulatory alignment that opened and closed based on political cycles, environmental assessments, and treaty obligations. Miss the window, and the same deal that looked brilliant today would be impossible next year. Miles understood this, which made his next move even more desperate. What if we restructured the deal to bring Leona back as a Viridian employee? Same role, enhanced compensation, full strategic authority over international initiatives. The offer hung in the air like a peace treaty offered after the war was already lost. I let the silence stretch for exactly 10 seconds before responding. "Miles, 3 hours ago you terminated my employment in front of our most important investors because you said my approach was too conservative. You replaced me with someone who had no experience with international energy law. You made it clear that Viridian's future didn't include my strategic expertise." I pulled out my phone and opened the voice memo app. "Would you like me to play back your exact words? I recorded them for my exit interview documentation." His face went pale. Recording workplace terminations was perfectly legal in Illinois, and Miles knew it. "The question now," I continued, "isn't whether I want to work for Viridian again. The question is whether Viridian wants to be a partner in the most successful renewable energy deal in Midwest history, or whether they'd prefer to explain to their shareholders how they lost control of a $2.1 billion project because of poor strategic planning." Harrison's phone rang. He answered it, listened for a moment, then put it on speaker. "This is David Riley from Meridian's legal department. We've completed our review of the Kessler Strategics partnership proposal. The structure is sound, the compliance framework is robust, and the terms are within acceptable parameters for a project of this scope. We recommend proceeding immediately." Victor's phone rang next. After a brief conversation in what sounded like Ukrainian, he looked up with finality. "The European Consortium is prepared to execute the partnership agreement within the hour. We've verified that Kessler Strategics holds all necessary regulatory certifications, and our compliance team confirms that no alternative framework could be implemented within our timeline requirements." Miles looked around the table at faces that were no longer waiting for his decision. The investors had made their choice. The regulatory framework was locked in place. The only question remaining was whether Viridian would be a partner in this deal or a bystander to their own project. "One final question," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If we agree to this partnership, what guarantee do we have that Kessler Strategics won't simply take over future projects entirely?" I smiled for the first time since walking into this building. "You have exactly the same guarantee I had when I spent 22 years building deals that other people took credit for," I said. "The guarantee that results matter more than politics, that competence outlasts corporate maneuvering, and that the people who actually understand how to make billion-dollar deals work will always be more valuable than the people who just know how to talk about them." I stood up and extended my hand across the table. "Do we have a partnership, Miles?" He stared at my outstretched hand for a long moment, then reached across the table and shook it. "We have a partnership." At 4:47 p.m., with 13 minutes to spare before the compliance deadline, the largest renewable energy deal in Midwest history officially became a Kessler Strategics joint venture. The signing ceremony that followed was unlike any I'd experienced in 22 years of deal-making. Instead of sitting at the side of the table as Viridian's representative, I sat at the head as Kessler Strategics' founder and CEO. The documents bore my company's letterhead alongside Singapore Capital Advisory, Meridian Holdings, and the European Energy Consortium. Viridian Core Capital was listed as the development partner important, but no longer indispensable. Miles signed each page with the mechanical precision of someone following a script he'd never wanted to read. Jenna Rowe sat beside him, taking notes with the diligence of someone who was finally beginning to understand the complexity of what she'd been asked to manage. And the three investors signed with the satisfaction of people who just secured the kind of regulatory certainty that made billion-dollar commitments possible. When the last signature was complete, Harrison stood and raised his coffee cup in what passed for a toast in the corporate world. "To partnerships that recognize expertise wherever it resides," he said, looking directly at me, "and to the kind of strategic thinking that turns potential disasters into generational opportunities." We drank coffee instead of champagne, but the taste of victory was unmistakable. As the investors prepared to leave, Eamon approached me with the portfolio he'd been carrying since the meeting began. "A small token of appreciation," he said, handing me a leather folder embossed with the Singapore Capital Advisory logo. "Documentation for 3 additional projects that might benefit from Kessler Strategics' particular expertise. Combined value approximately $4.7 billion. I opened the folder to find preliminary agreements for renewable energy initiatives in Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Each one structured with the same regulatory complexity that had made the Green Axis deal nearly impossible for traditional firms to navigate. These would require someone with very specific experience in cross-border compliance," Eamon continued. "Someone who understands that the most valuable expertise often resides outside traditional corporate hierarchies." Miles overheard the conversation and turned with an expression that suggested he was finally beginning to understand the scope of what had just happened. This wasn't just about one deal. This was about the systematic restructuring of how international renewable energy investments would be managed for the foreseeable future. "Congratulations, Leona," he said, extending his hand one final time. "I hope you'll consider Viridian for future development partnerships." It was as close to an apology as I was likely to get, and more professional courtesy than he'd shown me 3 hours earlier. "I'll certainly consider it," I replied, assuming Viridian can demonstrate the kind of strategic thinking that makes partnerships successful. By 6 p.m., the 50th floor of Viridian Core Capital was empty except for the cleaning crew and the ghosts of conversations that had changed everything. I gathered my materials, said goodbye to Nina Walsh, who'd been offered a position with Kessler Strategics starting Monday, and walked toward the elevator for what I knew would be the last time as someone seeking employment. The lobby that had felt like a mausoleum when I'd left 3 hours earlier now felt like the launching pad for something entirely new. The security guards who'd watched me leave in the middle of the afternoon now watched me leave as the architect of the most successful regulatory coup in Chicago's recent corporate history. My phone had been buzzing with calls and messages for the past hour. Headhunters who'd heard rumors about the afternoon's events. Renewable energy firms that suddenly wanted to discuss strategic consulting opportunities. Investment banks that were very interested in learning more about Kessler Strategics' compliance methodologies. But the message that mattered most was a text from Sarah Martinez. Deal officially filed with federal regulatory agencies. Kessler Strategics is now registered as the primary compliance entity for the largest international renewable energy transaction in United States history. Congratulations on becoming exactly who you were meant to be. I walked out onto South Wacker Drive as the sun was setting over Chicago, painting the glass towers gold and crimson, the same street where I'd walked as a junior analyst 22 years ago, full of ambition and completely unprepared for the realities of corporate politics. The same street where I'd walk this afternoon, carrying the knowledge that preparation, patience, and strategic thinking could overcome any attempt to diminish or erase the value of real expertise. Tomorrow, the business journals would run stories about the surprising partnership development in the renewable energy sector. They'd describe it as an innovative compliance solution that demonstrated the evolving nature of international energy investment. They'd use words like strategic realignment and regulatory optimization because corporate journalism preferred euphemisms to the simple truth that competence had defeated politics. But tonight, I drove home to an apartment that would soon be replaced by something more suitable to my new position, carrying contracts that represented not just financial success, but vindication of every late night, every careful analysis, every strategic decision that others had dismissed as overly cautious. They'd thought they were firing me to make room for someone bolder. Instead, they'd created their most formidable competitor. And the beautiful irony was that they'd done it using exactly the legal framework I'd convinced them to sign. 25 minutes from public humiliation to private triumph. Sometimes the best revenge is simply being too valuable to erase. Thank you for listening to this story of strategic patience and corporate justice. I'd love to hear where you're listening from around the world. Drop a comment below and let me know your location so we can connect. If this story of quiet determination resonating with you, please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts about workplace dynamics and the power of being truly indispensable. What's your take on turning professional setbacks into comebacks?